The night clamped down heavy on the convent, a shroud woven from ancient shadows. Candle flames danced on stone walls, painting grotesque figures that swayed like specters in a forgotten liturgy. In the chapel's cold heart, a girl of 17 knelt, her white dress, sewn by the same silent sisters who watched, pulled around her on the frigid floor. She trembled, not from the chill seeping into her bones, but from the unspeakable abyss yawning before her. 5 men stood there, cloaked in priestly habits, 5 figures of authority, gathered to consummate what the Church, in its chilling lexicon, termed a mystical marriage that very night.
5 times, before everyone, under a divine blessing that felt more like a curse. Her name was Katarina. Her dark hair, a vibrant cascade just hours before, was gone, shorn close to her scalp that morning. Her small, trembling hands clutched a worn rosary. Her eyes, bloodshot from endless weeping, held no more tears. There was a limit to sorrow, and she had long since breached it, days ago, when the dreadful news of her selection had reached her. This is no fable, no mere invention of a fevered mind. This is history, a narrative that slumbered for centuries in locked archives, shielded by crimson wax seals and the formidable silence of the powerful. But time, that relentless adjudicator, has a habit of exhuming what was too hastily buried. And when those documents finally saw the light, they brought with them a horror many would have preferred to leave entombed.
Today, you will be confronted with one of the most disturbing rituals ever sanctioned by medieval Christendom. A marriage that did not unite souls, that did not celebrate love, but served only power, guilt, and an absolute dominion over the female body. The question that lingers in the air, whispering through the crumbling stones of abandoned churches, remains: did this particular strain of sacred violence truly vanish into the past? Official ecclesiastical histories offer only vague references, faded footnotes, phrases like extreme ascetic customs or 14th century penitential practices, words sanitized, distant, almost innocent, as if describing prolonged fasts or voluntary flagellations. The Church has always known how to mask its wounds with Latin and liturgy, how to transmute screams into whispers, blood into symbolism, trauma into theology. Yet, the documents that survived tell a different story, one of flesh, of suffering, and a forced submission beneath the mantle of the sacred. In the Public Archive of Lisbon, a record dated 1624, catalogued under Cases of Divine Ecstasy and Supernatural Manifestations in Female Convents, runs 17 pages long. The script is tiny, the ink faded, but still legible. What is written there, with a chilling detachment, describes a ritual known as matrimonium quintum, the quintuple marriage. According to this official record, a novice, prior to professing her perpetual vows, was required to undergo the sacrament of corporeal divestment as a means of purifying the flesh before her definitive union with Christ our Lord. This sacrament, the text states, was administered by 5 clerics designated by the Holy Mother Church, each embodying one of the 5 sacred wounds of our Redeemer. The act was to be performed in a secluded chapel under absolute secrecy,
witnessed only by authorized ecclesiastical figures. 5 wounds, 5 men, 5 administrations, all in a single night.
But what did corporeal divestment truly entail? What transpired within that locked chapel while the other nuns prayed outside, rosaries clutched tight in trembling fingers, and fear a cold nut in their chests? The official version offers no explanation, no details, preferring the comfortable ambiguity of sacred words. However, letters penned by the novices themselves, discovered decades later, hidden in the walls of demolished convents, stitched inside straw mattresses, buried beneath garden stones, paint a stark, undeniable picture. What they describe is not divine ecstasy, but pure terror, nameless despair, and violence cloaked in liturgy.
One such letter, unearthed in 1887 during the demolition of the convent of Our Lady of Piety in Evora, was folded into quarters and tucked inside a Bible. The ink had almost entirely faded, but a few words remained discernible. "May God forgive me for writing this, but someone must know. Someone must bear witness that this happened, that it was not a dream, not a divine trial. It was." And there the sentence broke off, as if the very word itself was too immense to fit on paper or in the heart of the one who wrote it.
She was not chosen, she was designated. Often the youngest, the most vulnerable, the one with the least family to protect her or question her fate. Many of these girls had been given to the convent as children, pious dowries from impoverished families, or as penance for sins they never committed. 10 days before the ritual, the designated novice was removed from the convent's routine, taken to an isolated cell far from the other sisters. A cell without windows, only a small opening high on the wall, through which a thin thread of light entered during the day. At night, total darkness. Her diet was drastically reduced: stale bread, water, sometimes a thin soup of bitter herbs said to purify the blood, but which in truth weakened her, leaving her dizzy, submissive, incapable of clear thought or gathering the strength to resist. During these 10 days, the novice was forbidden to speak. An absolute vow of silence was enforced. If she broke it, she would be punished with an even more severe fast, with hours kneeling on grains of corn, with lashes across her back administered by the Mother Superior herself, who claimed she was expelling the rebellion still dwelling within that impure body.
A letter found in the convent of Santa Clara in Coimbra, dated 1347, describes this preparation with soul-wrenching detail. "I trembled so much my knees knocked together. The elder sisters held me by the arms as they led me to the cell. They said it was a blessing, that I should thank God for being chosen, that few had the honor of passing through the sacrament of divestment. But I felt I was being led to the slaughter, and there was nowhere to run. The walls were high, the doors locked, and God, if He existed, seemed to be looking the other way."
On the 10th day, the final preparations began. Before dawn, the novice was removed from her cell and led to a bathing room. There, 3 older nuns washed her in a stone basin filled with icy water mixed with bitter herbs, rue, wormwood, absinthe. They claimed these purified her. In reality, they burned her skin, leaving red marks that took days to disappear. After the bath, they cut her hair. Not merely trimmed, they shaved it close to her scalp with iron scissors that pulled and tore, sometimes drawing blood. Some novices fainted, but none could scream. Silence was mandatory until the very end. Finally,
They dressed her. The white gown was not beautiful. It was simple, coarse, made of raw linen that scratched her skin, sleeveless, unadorned, merely white, like a shroud, because, in a profound sense, that is what it represented, a death. The death of the girl she had been, the death of any hope for freedom, the death of herself.
Chapel where everything took place was not the main one. That one was grand, well lit, adorned with images of saints and gilded angels. No, the ritual chapel was different, smaller, hidden away in the convent's rear, along a corridor few nuns ever traversed. It had no stained glass windows, no frescoes of angels bearing lilies, only bare stone, damp walls that smelled of mold and burnt wax. A dark wooden crucifix hung on the wall, so ancient that Christ's face was no longer discernible, and in the center, a low altar covered with a red cloth. Red, not white, as one might expect in a ritual of purity. Not gold, as on feast days. Red, the color of blood, the color of sacrifice.
The 5 clerics entered in single file. They did not speak, did not look at one another. They simply positioned themselves around the altar, as if executing a military order. All wore dark habits, hoods that concealed part of their faces, but their eyes were visible, and in those eyes there was no pity, no doubt, only the cold certainty of one fulfilling a sacred duty. The novice was led to the chapel center. 2 nuns held her arms, not with force, but with a firmness that conveyed the absence of choice. She knelt before the altar, and then the marriage began.
The ritual followed a specific liturgy preserved in 11th century manuscripts found in the Vatican Library. Each cleric recited a Latin prayer before administering the sacrament. The prayers were drawn from the Psalms, biblical words used as justification for what was to follow, words of David, words of Isaiah, words of prophets who could never have imagined their verses employed in such a manner. Cor mundum crea in me Deus. Create in me a clean heart, O God. And then the first cleric approached.
An inquisitorial process preserved in the Toledo archives, dated 1492, mentions a similar case. A young woman named Isabel of Aragon, who had fled a convent years prior, was captured and brought before the Inquisition tribunal. Her crime, denouncing the ritual, breaking the silence. Her testimony was recorded verbatim by the Inquisitor scribe. They told me it was God's will, that each of them represented a wound of Christ, that my suffering brought me closer to the cross, that the more I suffered that night, the purer I would become in the eyes of the Lord. But there was no cross there, no God in that chapel, only pain and silence, a silence that screamed louder than any prayer, a silence that still echoes within me, even after so many years.
Isabel was deemed a heretic, a blasphemer. She was condemned to 20 years in solitary confinement, where she died 3 years later. She never spoke again, never wrote again, but her testimony survived, hidden among thousands of other processes, awaiting discovery. Why 5? Why not 3, like the Holy Trinity? Why not 7, like the sacraments? The answer lies in the medieval theology of guilt, a theology that viewed the feminine body as a battlefield, a territory to be conquered, an enemy to be subjugated. Woman, according to the church doctors, bore the mark of Eve. She was the gateway of sin into the world. Her body was considered dangerous, seductive, capable of leading holy men to perdition. Therefore, it needed to be controlled, dominated,
purified. The 5 wounds of Christ, the 2 hands nailed to the cross, the 2 feet pierced by the same nail, and the side opened by the Roman soldier's spear, symbolized the 5 senses that were to be subjugated in the novice.
Each sacrament, applied by one of the clerics, represented the mortification of one sense: sight, hearing, touch, taste, or smell. It was a theology of control, a liturgy of trauma, a way of transforming violence into virtue, of labeling sin as sanctity. And all of it was recorded, noted, archived as an act of faith, as a manifestation of divine grace, as if God had somehow ordained it. An anonymous letter found in the Vatican Secret Archives in 1998, during the cataloging of medieval documents, describes a case from 1381 in the region of Bavaria. The novice endured everything in silence as she was ordered. She did not scream, she did not cry, she only clenched her teeth and clutched the rosary so tightly her hands bled. At the end, she kissed the ring of each priest and thanked them for the purification, as was required, but her hands trembled so much she could barely hold the rosary.
Her eyes were empty, as if something within her had died that night. 3 days later, they found her hanged in her cell, using her own veil as a rope. The Mother Superior ordered her to be buried in unconsecrated ground, for she had committed the sin of despair. Despair. That was the name they gave to the victim's overwhelming anguish, as if despair itself were a transgression, as if no longer having the strength to live was a moral failing. Now tell me, to what extent can faith be used as a mask for horror? How far can the sacred justify the profane?
The other nuns knew. Every single one of them knew, because many had walked that same path years before. They bore the same invisible scars, carried the same haunting memories, endured the same nightmares that startled them awake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, trembling. Yet none spoke. To speak was heresy, to question a sin. And those who sinned faced a searing hell, not merely in the hereafter, but in the brutal present. The Inquisition's dungeons, public pyres, tortures that reduced the body to mangled flesh.
Convent operated as an invisible prison. It needed no iron bars, no armed guards. Guilt was the cage, fear the warden, and God, or more accurately, the idea of God they had constructed, was the overseer of this confinement. Some nuns attempted to write, leaving desperate notes hidden in wall crevices, beneath floorboards, inside Bibles that would never again be opened. They hoped someone, someday, would find them, that someone would learn the truth, that someone would declare, this was not sacred, this was a crime. Few of these letters survived. Most were destroyed when convents were demolished or renovated. Some were deliberately burned by Mother Superiors, intent on erasing any evidence. But those that remained are agonizing testaments to an era when silence was enforced with the same fervor as faith.
There is a particularly harrowing account found in 1923 during the restoration of a convent in Galicia, Spain. It was inscribed on a piece of parchment rolled tightly inside a spent candle. The author identified herself only as Sister M. I witnessed 3 novices endure the ritual in this convent, she wrote. The first lost her mind, tearing at her own hair at night, screaming nonsensical words. They said she was possessed by a demon. An exorcism was performed. She died during the ritual, her mouth choked with holy water forced down her throat.
The second tried to escape. She managed to leave the convent but was captured 3 days later. When they brought her back, she no longer spoke. She only stared ahead, her eyes fixed on something no one else could perceive. She died 6 months later. We never learned the cause. The third was my blood sister, my true sister. We entered this convent together as children. After that night, she looked me in the eyes one last time and whispered, "I am nothing now, neither human nor saint, merely an empty body that still breathes." 3 months later, she died of a fever, but I know it was not fever. It was shame. It was despair. It was the crushing weight of carrying something no one should ever have to carry. And I could not help her. I could not save her, because I too am a coward. I too am afraid. I too prefer silence to the pyre.
This, then, is the crushing weight of silence. It is not merely what remains unsaid. It is what is born alone. It is the secret that festers within the chest, a wound that never truly heals. Can you imagine the unbearable burden of such silence? Can you envision living for years, for decades, with such a truth locked inside, unable to utter a single word? When the night finally ended, the novice was escorted back to her cell. She walked alone, or rather, she was often carried, for many could no longer move their limbs. Their legs refused to obey, their entire bodies seemingly disconnected from their minds. She remained isolated for 3 more days. 3 days of complete fasting, 3 days of compulsory prayers, 3 days to integrate the received grace, as the official documents euphemistically stated. But there was no grace. There was only physical, emotional, spiritual agony, a pain nameless, unconfessable. To confess it would be to admit it was wrong.
Và they admit that was heresy. After these 3 days, she would return to the convent's routine, as if nothing had ever happened, as if that night had never existed. The other nuns never spoke of it. The Mother Superior made no mention, and the novice quickly learned that the best way to survive was to feign that it had indeed been a sacrament, a privilege, a blessing. Yet at night, when the candles were extinguished and the convent fell silent, many of these girls wept alone, their faces buried in pillows to muffle their sobs. They prayed not for salvation, but for oblivion, for a swift death, for anything that might liberate them from a prison not made of stone, but of memories.
Some managed to survive, to adapt. They buried that night so profoundly that it almost ceased to exist. They became exemplary nuns, obedient, silent, perfect. Others could not. They succumbed to madness, fell ill, or died young of causes officially recorded as fever, melancholia, or simply divine will. And a rare few, a very rare few, attempted to flee. But escaping a medieval convent was nearly impossible. The walls were high, the gates guarded. Even if they succeeded in getting out, where would they go? A woman alone, without family, without money, without protection, was doomed. She would be captured, violated, killed, or dragged back to the convent, where she would be publicly punished as an example. There was no escape, neither physical nor spiritual.
Have you ever paused to consider how many women throughout history have lived as prisoners in this manner? Not only in convents, but in forced marriages, in oppressive families, in societies that offered them no choice. What this ritual reveals is not merely about a distant era. It unveils something about human nature itself. It shows how power, when it cloaks itself in the sacred, becomes invisible, untouchable, unquestionable. As the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg, a specialist in popular culture and religious repression in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, wrote, "The line separating the sacred from the profane is thin and almost always drawn by power. And whoever possesses the power to define what is sacred also possesses the power to justify any atrocity in the name of God."
The quintuple marriage was not an aberration. It was not an isolated case of depraved priests acting on their own. It was a system, a structure, a perfectly organized mechanism of control, documented and legitimized by the ecclesiastical hierarchy itself. It was a method to transform the female body into a battleground of moral virtue. The Church, by monopolizing the discourse on purity, sin, and salvation, established the rules and punished anyone who dared to question them. And the rules were clear. Woman was sin, her body dangerous. And for her to approach God, she needed to be broken, subjugated, purified.
Guilt was the most effective weapon, more potent than iron chains, more formidable than stone walls, because guilt resides within. And when you believe your suffering is deserved, that your pain is the path to redemption, you cease to resist, you cease to fight, you accept, and in the end, you even give thanks. That was the objective, not purification, but breakage. To break the will, to break the spirit, to break any remnant of autonomy that the girl might still possess. And the most terrifying aspect is this mechanism did not perish with the Middle Ages, it merely changed its attire. It exchanged Latin for psychological jargon, convents for other institutions. It replaced priests with other figures of authority. But the underlying logic remains: to control through fear, to silence through guilt, to justify through the discourse of salvation.
The French philosopher Michel Foucault, in his analyses of power and the control of bodies, argued that power does not merely repress, it also produces. It produces truths, produces docile bodies, produces subjectivities molded in its image. And the body that has historically most needed to be controlled has always been the female body. This was precisely what transpired in those locked chapels. It was not merely physical violence, it was the production of a truth that such suffering was holy, necessary, divine. It was the production of a docile body, a woman who would never again question, never again resist, never again be her own mistress.
When we examine history with honesty, we realize that this pattern repeats across different cultures in different eras, always the same logic: to use the sacred to justify control, to use God to silence victims, to use faith to transform trauma into virtue. Can we, today, recognize when we are being shaped in the same manner, when our pain is being rationalized by discourses claiming superiority, when our silence is being purchased with promises of future redemption? The masked letter I will mention was found in 2003 during the restoration of an abandoned convent in Portugal near the city of Porto. It was sealed inside a brick wall, wrapped in a piece of fabric that had almost completely rotted away. The ink was faded, but still legible. It was written in 1418. Signed only with the initials AM, it read,
If anyone finds these words, even if it is 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, know this: we were not saints, we were prisoners. We did not choose God, we were delivered to Him as sacrifice.
And what they did to us in the name of faith was not love, it was murder. A slow murder of the soul, which is worse than the murder of the body, because the body dies quickly, but the soul agonizes for years. Let no one forget, let no one forgive, let no one say it was divine will. Because God, if He exists, was not in that chapel. He was as far away as we were from freedom.
No one completely forgot, but many forgave. Or worse, many pretended it never happened. They filed away the documents, locked up the records, demolished the convents where the rituals took place, as if tearing down stone could erase memories. Today, centuries later, we look at these stories and feel a comfortable distance. We think, that was then, that was there, that doesn't happen anymore. We are civilized, we are modern, we are different. But is that truly the case? Have the mechanisms of power changed so fundamentally? Or have they merely learned to camouflage themselves better? When an institution uses the sacred to justify control over bodies, when silence is imposed in the name of order, when victims are blamed for their own suffering, when women are taught that their pain is virtue, that their sacrifice is duty, that their submission is holiness, are we not, in some way, repeating the same ritual?
Perhaps with different words, different clothes, different altars, but the principle remains the same. Power sanctifies its own sin. And as long as we fail to name this, as long as we refuse to confront these stories they try to erase, as long as we do not question who defines what is sacred and what is profane, who decides what is purity and what is sin, who holds the authority to transform suffering into virtue, we will merely be repeating, generation after generation, the same errors, with different guises, with updated justifications, but the same violence at the core.
Catarina, that 17-year-old girl who knelt in that chapel at some point in the 11th century, never had a voice. She could never tell her story, never scream what she felt. But perhaps, in some way, through these hidden letters, through these forgotten documents, through these stories we insist on unearthing, she can finally be heard. And perhaps by hearing her, we can finally learn to recognize when the sacred is being used as a mask, when God is being invoked to justify the unjustifiable, when faith is being twisted into shackles. So I ask you, and I ask you to answer with sincerity, have these horrors truly remained in the past? Or does power in any era always find a way to sanctify its own sin? And more importantly, what are you willing to do to ensure that stories like this never happen again?
Because in the end, it is not enough to know history. We must learn from it. We must use this knowledge as a shield against the same mistakes. We must promise ourselves and all the Catarinas who came before us that we will never again let silence win, that we will never again let guilt be a weapon, that we will never again let the sacred justify horror. This truth, once unearthed, demands to be carried forward, a testament to the enduring human spirit, and a solemn warning against the abuses of power forever.